So here's how it worked. You're trapped between two boats with just your head and limbs sticking out. They force feed you milk and honey until you get horrible diarrhea. Then they smear that same honey all over you and just leave you on a stagnant lake. The filth and honey attract insects, which would eat your flesh and lay eggs inside you while you were still alive. And to make it all last longer, they'd come back every day to force feed you again. One person is said to have survived this for 17 days. 17 days!
And then there was Ling Chi. You've probably heard of it by its other name, death by 1,000 cuts, or the slow slicing. These punishments, there was no other goal. Not shame, not information, not a public show. The one and only objective was to make the act of dying last as long and be as painful as humanly possible. It's a method called scaphism, also known as the boats, and a lot of historians consider it to be one of the single most horrible ways to die ever invented.
The whole point of Ling Chi was terrifyingly simple. Keep the victim alive for as long as you can while you methodically slice pieces of their body off. There were even ritualized versions, like drawing knives with body parts written on them, saving the heart knife for last. Another version used a fishnet as a guide for where to slice, and the mercury variation is just a complete nightmare, using the sheer weight of the metal to basically peel a person's scalp off.
And finally, we have flaying, the careful, almost surgical removal of a person's skin. The truly awful scientific detail here is all about biology. The skin itself doesn't have major blood vessels, which means you don't bleed out quickly. A skilled executioner could remove most of a person's skin while they remained conscious through almost the entire agonizing process.
All right, so we're moving out of those hidden dungeons and into the bright light of the public square. Because these next punishments, they weren't just about killing someone. They were about putting on a show. A gruesome, terrifying show meant to prove the absolute power of the people in charge.
This right here is a first-hand account of something called blowing from a gun. You tie a person to the mouth of a canyon and boom. Yeah, death was instant. But trust me, this had nothing to do with mercy. It was all about the shock and awe, the visceral, explosive spectacle of seeing a human body just disintegrate in front of everyone. A crystal clear message about who's in charge.
So you have to think of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, the classic punishment for treason, not as a single event, but as a gruesome, multi-act play for the public. Each step was its own unique form of suffering and humiliation. And the grand finale? Chopping up the body and displaying the parts all over the country. It was a warning that kept on warning, long after the person was dead.
In these cases, the audience was a huge part of the punishment itself. With a brazen bull, they didn't just roast a person alive inside a metal statue, they literally engineered it so their screams would sound like a bellowing bull for the entertainment of the crowd. And in Roman decimation, you weren't just the audience, you were the executioner, forced by your commanders to beat one of your own friends to death. It's a brutal, but I guess effective way to enforce discipline.
Okay, pain wasn't always just for public shame or psychological warfare. Sometimes it had a very, very specific job to do. Which brings us to torture devices. Tools that were specifically engineered to break a person's will and get them to talk.
And just look at the design of these things. It's just chillingly calculated. You've got the rack, which is all about brute force, just stretching a person until their joints literally pop apart. But then you have something like the heretic's fork. It's more subtle. The point isn't blinding pain, it's sleep deprivation. The second you nod off from exhaustion, the prongs dig into your throat. Two totally different approaches, but they both have the same goal: make the victim confess.
I mean, the creativity here is just disturbing, isn't it? The Spanish donkey used a person's own body weight to slowly slice them in half. The rat's cup, it weaponizes an animal's basic survival instinct against you. And the castor oil barrels, a truly disgusting way to threaten someone with drowning in their own bodily fluids unless they talked.
So, wow. After all of that, you have to ask, what's the point of even looking at this stuff? Why drag ourselves through this catalog of cruelty? What can exploring this dark side of our history actually teach us?
Well, as we've gone through this, we've really seen four big reasons why. Four purposes behind all this pain. We saw punishment used for social control, to shame people into line. We saw it used as a tool for interrogation. We saw it used as a grand, terrifying spectacle of power. And finally, we saw punishment where the cruelty, the drawn-out suffering, was the entire point.
And that's the thing that's so tough to grapple with. These weren't just random, monstrous acts by individuals. These were systems. They were organized, state-sanctioned, and formalized. And that really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this incredible capacity for calculated cruelty, all done in the name of order, really tell us about our own ideas of justice and about the true nature of power itself?
Let's talk about punishment as a public show, a performance really, with a captive audience. The goal here wasn't just about causing pain, oh no. It was about shame, about sending a message and controlling everyone else through pure fear. A classic example of this is tarring and feathering. You'd have the victim stripped down, covered in hot, burning wood tar, and then have feathers dumped all over them. The point wasn't usually to kill them, but to inflict the most humiliation imaginable. I mean, to literally make them look like a giant chicken walking around the street. Now, for what was seen as the absolute worst crime in England, high treason, the punishment had to be the absolute worst horror imaginable. Being hanged, drawn, and quartered was this brutal step-by-step nightmare. But that last step, that was the key. They would display the person's body parts in public places, a gruesome warning that if you challenge the king, you won't just die, you'll be completely erased. So right there, you see two very different kinds of public punishment. One is all about shaming someone inside their own community, right? The other is just a raw, brutal display of state power. A message written in blood that treason will absolutely not be tolerated. But okay, what happens when you need to punish a whole group of people? Well, the Romans had a chillingly efficient answer for that: decimation. Just imagine an entire military unit, we're talking about 480 soldiers, is found guilty of something huge, like mutiny. They'd be split into groups of 10, and each group would draw lots. The soldier who picked the short straw, he was then killed by his own 9 comrades. It was this terrifying lottery, where it didn't even matter if you were guilty or not. Your fate was sealed by chance, and your best friends had to become your executioners. Okay, so from public spectacles, we're going to move to something a little more intimate and mechanical. This is where punishment becomes the mechanics of pain, where human creativity was put to use engineering devices of pure, unadulterated agony. And maybe the most infamous of these is the brazen bull. So the legend goes, this hollow bronze bull was made for a Greek tyrant named Phalaris. The idea was pretty simple. You lock a person inside, and then you light a fire under it. But the real horror? Oh, that was in the details. The sheer theatricality of this cruelty is just mind-boggling. The bull was apparently designed with a system of pipes that would take the victim's screams and turn them into the sound of a bellowing bull. Even the smoke from their burning body was funneled out to look like smoke coming from the statue's nostrils. This wasn't just an execution. It was suffering engineered as a work of art. Another device you've probably heard of was the rack. This one was less about the show and more about just grim efficiency. By stretching a person's body, it could dislocate every single joint. It was often used to try and get information out of people before it eventually killed them. You know, some devices were just diabolically simple. The heretic's fork was basically a collar with sharp spikes pointing at your chin and your chest. The device itself didn't hurt you, it just waited. The second you got too tired and your head started to droop, your own body weight would do the rest, causing the fork to pierce right into you. And that brings us to our final and, yeah, probably our most disturbing category: punishments that were engineered specifically to create the slowest death possible. Here, the entire goal was just to prolong the agony, turning cruelty into some kind of twisted endurance test. Impalement, which was famously used by Vlad the Impaler, is a perfect example. A person was pierced with a huge stake, but the executioners were often skilled enough to place it so that it would miss every vital organ, making sure death would take a very, very long time. But here's the thing, the real horror wasn't just the stake itself. It was a psychological nightmare of being forced to participate in your own torture. So the victim could actually use their own muscles to hold themselves up, keeping the stake from going deeper. But eventually, they'd get exhausted and slip down. The searing pain would then jolt them, and they'd scramble back up, only to repeat the whole cycle over and over again, sometimes for days, until their body just couldn't take it anymore. Another method of slow, agonizing death was flaying, removing a person's skin while they were still alive. It was this chillingly meticulous process.
See, because the skin itself doesn't have a lot of major blood vessels, a really skilled executioner could keep the victim from bleeding out too quickly, leaving them fully conscious to feel, well, everything.
But perhaps the most infamous method for prolonging death was Ling Qi. You probably know it as death by 1,000 cuts. This was a form of execution in China designed to maximize suffering, and there were dozens of variations of it, each one more horrifying than the last. I mean, some versions involve the executioner randomly drawing knives with body parts written on them to decide where to cut next. In another, they'd stretch a fishnet over the victim and just slice off the little bits of flesh that bulged through the holes. The goal was always the same: keep the person alive as long as possible while their body was literally taken apart piece by piece. But there is one method that is often called the absolute worst punishment ever conceived by a human mind: scaphism, also known as the boats. So, a victim was trapped between two rowboats with just their head and their arms and legs sticking out. Then, this bizarre ritual would start. They were force-fed milk and honey. This diet would cause horrible diarrhea, and then they'd smear that same mixture of milk and honey all over the person's skin to attract insects. They would be left in a swamp for bugs and vermin to feast on them and lay eggs inside their wounds. And every single day, they'd be brought back, cleaned, and force-fed again just to keep them alive. One person reportedly survived for 17 days, just slowly being eaten alive while trapped in their own filth. You know, looking back at all these horrific methods, it really forces you to see punishment as more than just a reaction to a crime. It's like a mirror. The creativity, the public spectacle, the chilling engineering, it all reveals something really deep about the values, the fears, and the power of the societies that created them. And that, of course, leads us to a final unavoidable question. If all of these punishments from the past reflect their times, what are future generations going to say when they look back at our methods of justice? What will our punishments say about us?